Okay, so when it comes to analog versus digital, there's so many variables, so many things to discuss, and perhaps we can hit them one by one. The most dominant topic in all of this, I think, is when you run audio through metal wire in the analog domain, electrons are pulsing, and when you do it digitally, it's an assimilation of that. So yes, you can do very well working in the box, working in plugins, and you can go for depth of field and size. And I think the industry is accommodating working in the box, particularly when it comes to timing and budgets and recalls and all types of stuff that really are important to the production of music and the distribution of music. But we've got, in our case, an analog console that got developed over the course of, in my experience, 29 years in the industry. Accidental discoveries, deliberate discoveries. I had mentioned in one of the previous videos that we patched a tube equalizer in the front of the chain accidentally where a de-esser would traditionally go. And then when we corrected that and put it in the middle of the chain in a place that we would normally put an equalizer, we liked it less because we enjoyed the saturation effect. So we put it back in that position, and to this day we are running a tube EQ in the front of our console for the most part. And when we designed the LMC for IK Multimedia, which is the digital version of our console, we actually put that in the front of that chain. And that plugin is actually an accumulation of all the gear in our chain with specific presets so that you can see the specialness of that analog console without actually having to build that chain yourself. And it even has some settings to get you started. So there's many aspects to this topic. I don't know if you have any you want to add to, or maybe we can break them down together.
Yeah.
But that's
So when I started 15 years ago now, there was a stigma around working digitally. It was something that was thought of as much like not preferred. You know, in fact, if you were mastering digitally, that was taboo. That was a party foul. And then over time, as the years went by, it started shifting into maybe this is okay. In fact, and then all the professionals, all the seasoned pros that had been hard, fast, digital, analog users, had started kind of gravitating towards maybe working a little bit more digitally, and then it got a little bit more accepted, and then some of these pros started coming out with signature plugins, and they sounded good, and, characters like Stephen Slate came along and, was very, very loud and proud about the benefits of what you can do with working digitally, and how these practices that have been tested can be then realized in this new platform and ways of working. And it all kind of came into a place of now it's a very much accepted and in fact expected for everybody to have the ability to work digitally, as it is on us as well. So the benefits of working digitally are, as Gavin was saying, certainly recallability, the ability to try something, commit to it, and then try something different, A/B to those things in real time very, very quickly without having to do a print and then, the old school way, which would be analog, of having to actually print it in real time, recall it or make an adjustment, then A/B at that point. So it speeds up the process greatly working digital. Now, in terms of its actual sonic audio integrity, there's something that is often missed because it's the individual, it's the person working on it. How do they, as an artist, how are they best realizing what they are trying to achieve? If you take somebody that's really, really versed in working with pastels, and then you give them some watercolors, and you take another watercolor expert and give them pastels, they're going to do good jobs. But when they're using their own medium, when they're really, really locked into what they do, you're going to get the best of that person. So you have to take that into consideration too. Gavin and I, we were raised working on analog consoles every day. The sensibilities that we've harnessed and we've developed have everything to do with our integration and our reaction to what that console is doing to the music. And what it's doing to the music is influencing our decisions in real time. So it's a cyclical thing, and the human being is very much a part of that. So when we're working digitally, we're taking all of that experience, all of those sensibilities, but now we're working digitally. So you're getting the human, but now with different tools and a different setting. So we're going to come up with great results either way. But not to forget, the way we work is greatly based off how these consoles are built and how the gain structure within the consoles has evolved over time. Everything that Gavin learned from Doug, everything that I learned from Gavin, and then we share ideas as the years go by, and it all amounts to this this broad amount of experience and ways of working that turns out great results.
That's actually a key point right there, because everything that we're talking about is broad strokes. You know, if you really think about it, the human is a big variable in this. It's the way the human interacts with working in the box or working analog. But there's so many choices throughout. There's so many slivers within that human experience, in addition to the technological differences. And when you break down those choices, the only thing that anybody ever sees from that is the broad stroke at the end of the day. How does that meal taste? Not how does the sauce taste, how does the meat taste, how does the French fry taste? How does the overall experience come to you? And there's all types of external influence as well. You know, what's the weather that day? You know, what kind of mood are you in? So there's a big holistic experience behind it all. So all of these slivers that come together create a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And we talk about that in our videos for the plugin for the LMC with the IK. We talk about a lot about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And the experience of music is that, and the listener is a part of that, because they have all these influences going on. And when the engineer delivers that final result, it's an accumulation of all these slivers. And how you use this, you know. So I'm talking a little philosophical here. I'm waxing poetic, but this is more of a philosophical video and less of a technical tutorial. So it's very important to note that, yeah, you can do a great job digitally or analog, but it's really the variable of the human being using them. Now, one of the things that I like to do is I like to constantly check out all the plugins available and build a chain that mimics the analog console I work on, and routinely change out the gear and experiment with gain structure. And that's something that I think is very useful. When you build a chain, you might want to actually drop some level or raise some level at different points within that chain, so that you can get the output of a limiter to bloom more than clamp down. So I experiment with things like that. When we designed the LMC, we spent a year designing that to accomplish this exact thing. So you don't end up with this clamped down compressed signal, but something that actually blooms even when you're compressing. So I'm experimenting with that constantly, and I'm very pleased. I think the industry of plugins is very, very put together now, especially more than at any other time, you know, in high resolution audio, and the capabilities are pretty magnificent. But like, as Ruben says, you know, if you give somebody, you know, pastels versus watercolors, if that was the analogy you made, you know, I'm used to one thing, and so is Ruben. So we have that available to us. We're not going to stop using it, but we constantly are staying on top of every technology as well.
And you know, we're very sensitive to this process and how we inject ourselves into this process. You know, I think once you do this day in, day out, you'll realize that you start having certain tendencies. You know, you'll start realizing that you start doing the same thing in certain ways, and you might end up purposely doing something different to kind of get yourself out of that. You know, for instance, if I start EQing something into a particular type of compression, you know, like let's say I'm working on an EDM track, right? And I'm EQing into some compression and some really transparent limiting, if you will, on this particular occasion. And I find that in order to get this track to really hit hard and be the best, be the most it can be, I just happen to be warming up the track in the low mids or something like that, giving it some really some thick body for everything to sit on, right? Some really create some punch and some impact, because that maybe that's what the mix needs. Maybe it's a little thin on the mix, and that's what needs to be achieved in mastering. I'm noticing that I'm doing that on the track, so then I'll maybe print a version and I'll listen to it down and I'll live with it, and then I'll go flat again and I'll start building it again because I want to beat myself, and I might maybe just do a shelf, you know, maybe a few tenths of a dB all the way down at 32 hertz, right? And then I'll EQ all around that, and I'll notice that I'll end up in a place where I'm not warming it up as much, because I have that bottom already there to kind of work off of. So my other decisions are being influenced by this original kind of decision to lead down the same road but in a different way. Will it be better? Maybe, maybe not. The only way to know, and I don't care how many years you've been doing this, you have to try this. If you have that itch to scratch, you won't know if it's better until you go through the process and see. And that's the same with anybody working on it. You can develop some confidence to kind of know to some degree, but the real test is to actually do it and see where you end up on that final A-B flip. And here's the other thing to take into account. The initial A-B flip can sometimes be deceiving. If you flip over to something and it's louder and it's brighter and it's bigger, you can quickly think, oh, that's better. But then you start listening for more than a few seconds, and you start to think, okay, am I grooving with this track? Am I hearing into it, or is it just bigger on the initial flip? Because there could be something very musical about something that actually doesn't sound as good on the A to B flip in the instant. But when you listen to it for more than 30 seconds or so, it's very clear which one is the winner. At that point. So these are all the types of things we take into account in terms of our decision making, in terms of how we go about the process, whether it's analog or digital.
Well, also, a lot of people that work in the box, they'll have in and out of a particular piece of analog gear, a compressor, something analog. So they're going through the D to A's and the A to D's. In our case, because we have the analog console and we're converting through the interface digital to analog, and then getting a very specific, very carefully curated gain structure, and then back to digital with our final capture. If we decide to use a plugin, most likely we're not going to do it on our capture, we're going to do it on the mix before the conversion to analog for the console. So if we talk to a client and say, hey, maybe this tweak or that can happen before we get the mix, but they're out of time or budget or for whatever reason cannot do it, we actually have the flexibility to work that way, and that's kind of the add-on, but the analog console is the dominant thing. And a lot of people that are working in the box that put an analog device on it, that the working in the box is the dominant, and the analog device is the kind of add-on. So in our world, it's in reverse. So that's just something to note in all of this as well.
And Gavin and I, we both enjoy working into processes that hold bottom, right? That kind of darken, that kind of shift the EQ, the frequency, the global frequency, down a little bit to get some weight, some girth, and some heaviness, so that then we can then EQ open into that. And that's one of the, I don't know, quote unquote,
with saturation, so it's not edgy and brittle and saws your head off. It's a warm openness. That's part of the bloom that we keep talking about.
And that bloom allows you to expand in all directions. How do you get something warmer and brighter and more open and bigger all around, like you're blowing up a balloon? How do you achieve that? Well, you do processes that work in juxtaposition to one another, right? You darken something, you brighten something into something that's naturally darkening it, right? And that's how it just expands. That's one way to do it, at least. You work up into compression. You EQ into the compression, because the compression's working, and you understand the shape that compression is creating based off how it's integrating with the music and whatever the music is at hand.
And in the plug-in chain that I'm experimenting with, where I play with gain within the chain, that's a process that I'm exploring, and that's a process that's built into the LMC, by the way. That blooming thing that happens, that saturation that happens. But yeah, what you're really talking about is saturation, and how the gain structure of one device works against the structure of another. So in the digital domain, that gain structure, those electrons are not being pushed through that wire, and it's a simulation of that, as I mentioned earlier. So that's where you have to get very creative about how to push one into the other to create that kind of bloom. So you'll darken one so that you can brighten the other, and at the end, in theory, end up with this holistic, greater than the sum of its parts, blooming track that nobody really knows how you got there. They just go, oh, great song. I'm so connected with that music.
Yeah.
That's really the end of the day, what we're talking about.
And a lot of this stuff is very feel-based. It's not like we're deliberately doing this. In other words, if you're working through an analog console or digital process, either one, and you're trying to achieve some saturation, right? It's very different than searching for that saturation or adding a process that just inherently creates saturation, and that influences your decisions further. So a lot of times as we're working into our analog process, it's not like we're trying to find that saturation. That saturation exists because it just exists inherently just because we're going through it. And our end result will be very much influenced by how we're listening and how we're going through that process. So we might end up in a very different place if we're working analog versus working digital because there's two different paths. Both will be great, both will have its own character and a unique feel, and it'll also be ready for prime time. It'll sound great on the platforms, everything that's expected of a mastering engineer and a mastering job and process. But you might end up in different places based off how those processes influence your decision making along the way. And as we talked a bit before, it might change a little bit from a Tuesday to a Thursday, what have you, based off your feeling and how you show up that day relating to that music. And that's not unique to us. That's the same with whoever's working on it. But a good mastering engineer at the same time will have a sense of inner continuity. In other words, there's a particular place, whatever you're handed every day, whatever mix you're handed every day, you'll have a very specific sense of where that can be best realized in its finished form. And we'll take it there. And it could be a little bit here, it could be a little bit there, and each place could have something great about it. And sometimes we'll even send more than one version to a client and say, hey, these are both great, and either one's fine. Which one impacts you more? Which one are you resonating with more? And that's really good insight. And that actually just strengthens the bond between mastering engineer and mixing engineer, or mastering engineer and producer, or whoever we're working with, because that allows us to dig a little further into what really makes them happy and what makes them excited about what we can bring. And it's all music.
And sometimes what I'll do is, if we have a little extra time, which is rare, but if we do, and Ruben's working on something, or I'm working on something, we'll try to replicate what we can do in the analog console with a digital chain. And this is an exercise that actually keeps us up to date with all the plugins coming out, how to work with all the plugins, how to develop a chain, how they go into each other, how to come up with gain structure to where they integrate to create one whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And we'll try to beat what's happening on the analog console. And we'll have an internal discussion about it. And oftentimes we won't send that off to the client. It'll just be our way of staying on top of our game. But every once in a while, we'll send that out and give it as an option to a client as well. So we're paying very close attention to existing in the digital realm. We're participating in the design of digital products. We've got one plugin out on the market right now and another one coming, and ideas for a few others as well. So it's a very important aspect of the development of the music business, the pro audio industry and the semi-pro audio industry as well. In every respect, it's a tool that allows you to make music when 20 years ago that didn't exist. So it's important for those artists to express. And it's a technology we support wholeheartedly.